But this thing was seen clearly 87 miles away, or even more, if it wasn't midway between the two cities. Why, it would have to be 1,000 feet in diameter. Even larger. Riedel was silent a moment. What was the word Mantell used? Tremendous. I tried to visualize the thing, but my mind balked. One thing was certain now. It was utterly impossible that any nation on Earth could have built such an enormous airborne machine. Just to think of the force required to hold it in the sky was enough to stagger any engineer. We were years away, perhaps centuries, from any such possibility. As if he had read my thoughts, Riedel said soberly, "There's no other possible answer." It was a huge spaceship, perhaps the largest ever to come into our atmosphere. It was clear now why such desperate efforts had been made to explain away the object Mantell had chased. What about that Eastern Airlines sighting? I asked. Well, first, said Riedel, it wasn't any remote control guided missile. I'll say it again, it would be sheer insanity. Suppose that thing had crashed in Macon. At that speed it could have plowed its way for blocks, right through the buildings. It could have killed hundreds of people, burned the heart out of the city. If it was a missile, or some hush-hush experimental job, then it was piloted. But they don't test a job like that on any commercial airways. And they don't fool around at 5,000 feet where people will see the thing streaking by and call the newspapers. To power a 100-foot wingless ship, especially at those speeds, would take enormous force. Not as much as a V-2 rocket, but tremendous power. The fuel load would be terrific. Certainly, the pilot wouldn't be circling around Georgia and Alabama for an hour, buzzing airliners. I'll stake everything that we couldn't duplicate that spaceship's performance for less than $50 million. It would take something brand new in jets. Riedel paused. He looked at me grimly. And the way I'd have to soup it up, it would be a damned dangerous ship to fly. No pilot would deliberately fly it that low. He'd stay up where he'd have a chance to bail out. I told him what I had heard about the blueprints the Air Force was said to have rushed. Of course they were worried, said Riedel. And probably they still are. But I don't think they need be. So far, there's been nothing menacing about these spaceships. When I got him back to the Gorman case, Riedel drew a sketch on his pad, showing me his idea of the disc light. He estimated the transparent rim as not more than 5 feet in diameter. Possibly smaller, he said. You recall that Gorman said the light was between 6 and 8 inches in diameter. He also said it seemed to have depth. That was in the Air Force report. You think all the mechanism was hidden by the light? Only possible answer, said Riedel. But just try to imagine crowding a motor, or jet controls for rim jets, along with remote controls and a television device, in that small space. Plus your fuel supply. I don't know any engineer who would even attempt it. To carry that much gear, it would take a fair-sized plane. You could make a disk large enough, but the mechanism and fuel section would be 2 or 3 feet across, at least. So Gorman's light must have been powered and controlled by some unique means. The same principle applies to all the other light reports I've heard. No shape behind them, high speed, and intelligent maneuvers. That thing was guided from some interplanetary ship, hovering at a high altitude, Riedel declared. But I haven't any idea what source of power it used. Until then, I had forgotten about Art Green's letter. I told Riedel what Art had said about the Geiger counter. I knew they went over Gorman's fighter with a Geiger counter, Riedel commented. But they said the reaction was negative. If Green is right, it's interesting. It would mean they have built incredibly small atomic engines. But with a race so many years ahead of us, it shouldn't be surprising. Of course, they may also be using some other kind of power our scientists say is impossible. I was about to ask him what he meant when his secretary came in. Mr. Carson is waiting, she told Riedel. He had a 4 o'clock appointment. As I started to leave, Riedel looked at his calendar. I hate to break this up. It's a fascinating business. What about coming in Friday? I'd like to see the rest of those case reports. Fine, I said. I've got a few more questions, too. Going out, I made a mental note of the Friday date. Then the figure clicked. It was just 3 months since I'd started on this assignment. 3 months ago. At that time I'd only been half sure that the saucers were real. If anyone had said I'd soon believe they were spaceships, I'd have told him he was crazy. Chapter 13. Before my date with Riedel, I went over all the material I had, hoping to find some clue to the space visitor's planet. It was possible, of course, that there was more than one planet involved.
Project Saucer had discussed the possibilities in it. Report of April 27, 1949.
April 27th, 19. Project Saucer had discussed the possibilities in it. Report of April 27th, 1949. I read over this section again. Since flying saucers first hit the headlines almost 2 years ago, there has been wide speculation that the aerial phenomena might actually be some form of penetration from another planet. Actually, astronomers are largely in agreement that only one member of the solar system beside Earth is capable of supporting life. That is Mars. Even Mars, however, appears to be relatively desolate and inhospitable, so that a Martian race would be more occupied with survival than we are on Earth. On Mars, there exists an excessively slow loss of atmosphere, oxygen, and water, against which intelligent beings, if they do exist there, may have protected themselves by scientific control of physical conditions. This might have been done, scientists speculate, by the construction of homes and cities underground where the atmospheric pressure would be greater and thus temperature extremes reduced. The other possibilities exist, of course, that evolution may have developed a being who can withstand the rigors of the Martian climate, or that the race, if it ever did exist, has perished. In other words, the existence of intelligent life on Mars, where the rare atmosphere is nearly devoid of oxygen and water, and where the nights are much colder than our Arctic winters, is not impossible but is completely unproven. The possibility of intelligent life also existing on the planet Venus is not considered completely unreasonable by astronomers. The atmosphere of Venus apparently consists mostly of carbon dioxide with deep clouds of formaldehyde droplets, and there seems to be little or no water. Yet, scientists concede that living organisms might develop in chemical environments which are strange to us. Venus, however, has two handicaps. Her mass and gravity are nearly as large as the Earth. Mars is smaller, and her cloudy atmosphere would discourage astronomy, hence space travel. The last argument, I thought, did not have too much weight. We were planning to escape the Earth's gravity. Martians could do the same with their planet. As for the cloudy atmosphere, they could have developed some system of radio or radar investigation of the universe. The Navy research units, I knew, were probing the far-off Crab Nebula in the Milky Way with special radio devices. This same method, or something far superior, could have been developed on Venus or other planets surrounded by constant clouds. After the discussion of solar system planets, the Project Saucer report went on to other star systems. Outside the solar system, other stars, 22 in number, have satellite planets. Our Sun has 9. One of these, the Earth, is ideal for existence of intelligent life. On 2 others, there is a possibility of life. Therefore, astronomers believe reasonable the thesis that there could be at least one ideally habitable planet for each of the 22 other eligible stars. After publication of our findings in True, several astronomers said that many planets may be inhabited. One of these was Dr. Carl F. von Weizsäcker, noted University of Chicago physicist. On January 10, 1950, Dr. von Weizsäcker stated, "Billions upon billions of stars found in the heavens may each have their own planets revolving about them. It is possible that these planets would have plant and animal life on them similar to the Earth's." After narrowing the eligible stars down to 22, the Project Saucer report goes on. The theory is also employed that man represents the average in advancement and development. Therefore, 1/2 the other habitable planets would be behind man in development, and the other half ahead. It is also assumed that any visiting race could be expected to be far in advance of man. Thus, the chance of space travelers existing at planets attached to neighboring stars is very much greater than the chance of space-traveling Martians. The one can be viewed as almost a certainty, if you accept the thesis that the number of inhabited planets is equal to those that are suitable for life and that intelligent life is not peculiar to the Earth. The most likely star was Wolf 359, 8 light-years away. I thought for a minute about traveling that vast distance. It was almost appalling, considered in terms of man's lifespan. Of course, dwellers on other planets might live much longer. If the speed of light was not an absolute limit, almost any space journey would then be possible. Since there would be no resistance in outer space, it would be simply a matter of using rocket power in the first stages to accelerate to the maximum speed desired. In the latter phase, the rocket's drive would have to be reversed to decelerate for the landing. The night before my appointment with Riedel, I was checking a case report when the phone rang. It was John Steele. "Are you still working on the saucers?" he asked. "If you are, I have a suggestion, something that might be a real lead."
I could use a lead right now, I told him. I can't give you the source, but it's one I consider reliable, said Steele. This man says the discs are British developments. This was a new one. I hadn't considered the British. Steele talked for over half an hour, expanding the idea. The saucers, his informant said, were rotating discs with cambered surfaces, originally a Nazi device. Near the end of the war, the British had seized all the models, along with the German technicians and scientists who had worked on the project. The first British types had been developed secretly in England, according to this account. But the first tests showed a dangerous lack of control. The discs streaked up to high altitudes, hurtling without direction. Some had been seen over the Atlantic, some in Turkey, Spain, and other parts of Europe. The British then had shifted operations to Australia, where a guided missile test range had been set up. This part, I knew, could be true. There was such a range. After improving their remote control system, which used both radio and radar, they had built discs up to 100 feet in diameter. These were launched out over the Pacific, the first ones straight eastward over open sea. British destroyers were stationed at 100-mile and later 500-mile intervals to track the missiles by radar and correct their courses. At a set time, when their fuel was almost exhausted, the discs came down vertically and landed in the ocean. Since part of the device was sealed, the discs would float, then a special launching ship would hoist them aboard, refuel them, and launch them back toward a remote base in Australia, where they were landed by remote control. Since then, Steele said, the discs' range and speed had been greatly increased. The first tests of the new discs was in the spring of 1947, his informant had told him. The British had rushed the project because of Soviet Russia's menacing attitude. Their only defense in England, the British knew, would be some powerful guided missile that could destroy Soviet bases after the first attack. In order to check the range and speeds accurately, it was necessary to have observers in the Western Hemisphere. The discs were now traversing the Pacific. The ideal test range, the British decided, was one extending over Canada, where the discs could be tracked and even landed. If the account was right, said Steele, a base had been set up in the desolate Hudson Bay country. Special radar tracking stations had also been established to guide the missiles toward Australia and vessels at sea. These stations also helped to bring in missiles from Australia. Some of the disc missiles were supposed to have been launched from a British island in the South Pacific, others came all the way from Australia. Still others were believed to have been launched by a mothership stationed between the Galapagos Islands and Pitcairn. It was these new discs that had been seen in the United States, Alaska, Canada, and Latin America, Steele's informant had told him. At first, the sightings were due to imperfect controls. The discs sometimes failed to keep their altitude, partly because of conflicting radio and radar beams from the countries below. Responding to some of these mixed signals, Steele said, the discs had been known to reverse course, hover or descend over radar and radio stations, or circle around at high speeds until their own control system picked them up again. For this reason, the British had arranged a simple detonator system, operated either by remote control or automatically under certain conditions. In this way, no disc would crash over land, with the danger of hitting a populated area. If it descended below a certain altitude, the disc would automatically speed up its rotation, then explode at a high altitude. When radar trackers saw that a disc was off course and could not be realigned, the nearest station then sent a special signal to activate the detonator system. This was always done, Steele had been told, when a disc headed toward Siberia. There had previously been a few cases when Australian-launched discs had got away from controllers and appeared over Europe. I listened to Steele's account with mixed astonishment and suspicion. It sounded like a pipe dream, but if it was, it had been carefully thought out, especially the details that followed. At first, Steele said, American defense officials had been completely baffled by the disc reports. Then the British, learning about the sightings, had hastily explained to top-level American officials. An agreement had been worked out. We were to have the benefit of their research and testing and working models, in return for helping to conceal the secret. We were also to aid in tracking and controlling the missiles when they passed over this country. And I gather we paid in other ways, Steele said. My source says this played a big part in increasing our aid to Britain, including certain atomic secrets. That could make sense. Sharing such a secret would be worth all the money and supplies we had poured into England. If America and Great Britain both had a superior long-range missile, it would be the biggest factor I knew for holding off war. But the long ranges involved in Steele's explanation made the thing incredible. How are they powered? What fuel do they use? I asked him. That's the one thing I couldn't get, said Steele. This man told me it was the most carefully guarded secret of all. They've tapped a new source of power. If he means atomic engines, I said, I don't believe it. I don't think anyone is that far along. No, Steele said earnestly. He said it wasn't that. And the rest of the story hangs together. Privately, I thought of 2 or 3 holes, but I let that go. If it's British, I said, do you think we should even hint at it? I don't see any harm, Steele answered. The Russians undoubtedly know the truth.
They have agents everywhere. It might do a lot of good for American-British relations. Anyway, it would offset any fear that the saucers are Soviet weapons. Then you're not worried about that angle anymore? Steele laughed. No, but it had me going for a while. It was a big relief to find out the discs are British. What's the disc ceiling? I asked, abruptly. Oh, 60,000 feet, at least, said Steele. After a moment he added quickly, that's just a guess, they probably operate much higher. I didn't think to ask. Before I hung up, he asked me what I thought of the British explanation. It's certainly more plausible than the Soviet idea, I said. I thanked him for calling me, and put down the phone. I was tempted to point out the flaws in his story. But I didn't. If he was sincere, it would be poor thanks for what he had told me. If he was trying to plant a fake explanation, it wouldn't hurt to let him think I'd swallowed it. When I saw Riedel, I told him about Steele. It does look like an attempt to steer you away from the interplanetary answer, Riedel agreed, though he may be passing on a tip he believes. You think there could be any truth in the British story? Would the British risk a 100-foot disc crashing in some American city? Said Riedel. No remote control is perfect, and neither is a detonator system. By some freak accident, a disc might come down in a place like Chicago, and then blow up. I just can't see the British any more than ourselves letting huge unpiloted missiles go barging around the world, flying along airways and over cities. Certainly, they could have automatic devices to make them veer away from airliners, but what if a circuit failed? I go along with that, I said. I don't say the British don't have some long-range missiles, Riedel broke in. Every big nation has a guided missile project. But no guided missile on Earth can explain the Mantell case and the others we've discussed. I showed him the material I had on the Nazi disc experiments. Riedel skimmed through it and nodded. I can tell you a little more, he said. Some top Nazi scientists were convinced we were being observed by space visitors. They'd searched all the old reports. Some sighting over Germany set them off about 1940. That's what I was told. I think that's where they first got the idea of trying out oval and circular airfoils. Up to then, nobody was interested. The rotation idea uses the same principle as the helicopter, but nobody had even followed that through. The Nazis went to work on the discs. They also began to rush space exploration plans, the orbiting satellite idea. I think they realized these spaceships were using some great source of power we hadn't discovered on Earth. I believe that's what they were after, that power secret. If they'd succeeded, they'd have owned the world. As it was, that space project caused them to leap ahead of everybody with rockets. When I asked Riedel how he thought the spaceships were powered, he shrugged. Probably cosmic rays hold the answer. Their power would be even greater than atomic power. There's another source I've heard mentioned, but most people scoff at it. That's the use of electromagnetic fields in space. The Earth has its magnetic field, of course, and so does the Sun. Probably all planets do. There's a man named Fernand Roussel who wrote a book called The Unifying Principle of Physical Phenomena, about 1943. He goes into the electromagnetic field theory. If he's right, then there must be some way to tap this force and go from one planet to another without using any fuel. You'd use your first planet's magnetic field to start you off and then coast through space until you got into the field of the next planet. At least, that's how I understand it. But you'd be safer sticking to atomic power. That's been proved. Most of our conversations had been keyed to the technical side of the flying saucer problem. But before I left this time, I asked Riedel how the thought of space visitors affected him. "Oh, at first I had a queer feeling about it," he answered. "But once you accept it, it's like anything else. You get used to the idea." "One thing bothers me," I said. "When I try to picture them, I keep remembering the crazy-looking things in some of the comics. What do you suppose they're really like?" "I've thought about it for months." Riedel slowly shook his head. "I haven't the slightest idea."
Chapter 14. That evening, after my talk with Riedel, the question kept coming back in my mind. What were they like? And what were they doing here? From the long record of sightings, it was possible to get an answer to the second question. Observation of the Earth followed a general pattern. According to the reports, Europe, the most populated area, had been more closely observed than the rest of the globe until about 1870. By this time, the United States, beginning to rival Europe in industrial progress, had evidently become of interest to the spaceship crews. From then on, Europe and the Western Hemisphere, chiefly North America, shared the observers' attention. The few sightings reported at other points around the world indicate an occasional checkup on the Earth in general. Apparently World War I had not greatly concerned the space observers. One reason might be that our aerial operations were still at a relatively low altitude. But World War II had drawn more attention, and this had obviously increased from 1947 up to the present time. Our atomic bomb explosions and the V-2 high-altitude experiments might be only coincidence, but I could think of no other development that might seriously concern dwellers on other planets. It was a strange thing to think of some far-off race keeping track of the Earth's progress. If Riedel was right, it might even have started in prehistoric time, a brief survey, perhaps once a century or even further spaced, then gradually more frequent observation as cities appeared on the Earth. Somewhere on a distant planet there would be records of that long survey. I wondered how our development would appear to that far-advanced race. They would have seen the slow-sailing ships, the first steamships, the lines of steel tracks that carried our first trains. Watching for our first aircraft, they would see the drifting balloons that seemed an aerial miracle when the Montgolfiers first succeeded. More than a century later, they would have noted the slow, clumsy airplanes of the early 1900s. From our gradual progress to the big planes and bombers of today, they could probably chart our next steps toward the stratosphere, and then space. During the last 2 centuries, they would have watched a dozen wars, each one fiercer than the last, spreading over the globe. Adding up all the things they had seen, they could draw an accurate picture of man, the Earth creature, and the increasingly fierce struggle between the Earth races. The long survey held no sign of menace. If there had been a guiding purpose of attack and destruction, it could have been carried out years ago. It was almost certain that any planet race able to traverse space would have the means for attack. More than once, during this investigation, I had been asked, if the saucers are interplanetary, why haven't they landed here? Why haven't their crews tried to make contact with us? There was always the possibility that the planet race or races could not survive on Earth, or that their communications did not include the methods that we used. But I found that hard to believe. Such a superior race would certainly be able to master our radio operations, or anything else that we had developed, in a fairly short time. And it should be equally simple to devise some means of survival on Earth, just as we were already planning special suits and helmets for existence on the Moon. During a talk with a former intelligence officer, I got a key to the probable explanation. Why don't you just reverse it? List what we intend to do when we start exploring space. That'll give you the approximate picture of what visitors to the Earth would be doing.
Naturally, all the details of space plans have not been worked out, but the general plan is clear. After the first successful Earth satellites, we will either attempt a space base farther out or else launch a moon rocket. Probably many round trips to the Moon will be made before going farther in space. Which planet will be explored first after the Moon? According to Air Force reports, it is almost a certainty that planets outside the solar system are inhabited. But because of the vast distances involved, expeditions to our neighboring planets may be tried before the more formidable journeys. More than one prominent astronomer believes that life, entirely different from our own, may exist on some solar planets. Besides Mars, Jupiter, and Venus, there are 5 more that, like the Earth, revolve around the Sun. One of the prominent authorities is Dr. H. Spencer Jones, Astronomer Royal. In his book Life on Other Worlds, Dr. Jones points out that everything about us is the result of changing processes, begun millenniums ago and still going on. We cannot define life solely in our own terms. It can exist in unfamiliar forms. It is conceivable, Dr. Jones states in his book, that we could have beings, the cells of whose bodies contain silicon instead of the carbon, which is an essential constituent of our cells and of all other living cells on the earth. And that because of this essential difference between the constitution of those cells and the cells of which animal and plant life on the earth are built up, they might be able to exist at temperatures so high that no terrestrial types of life could survive.
According to Dr. Jones, then, life could be possible on worlds hotter and drier than ours. It could also exist on a very much colder one, such as Mars. Even if a survey of the Sun's planets proved fruitless, it would decide the question of their being populated. Also, it would provide valuable experience for the much longer journeys into space. No one expects such a survey until we have a space vehicle able to make the round trip. One-way trips would tell us nothing, even if volunteers offered to make such suicidal journeys. The most probable step will be to launch a space vehicle equipped with supplies for a long time, perhaps a year or two, within the solar system. Since Mars has been frequently mentioned as a source of the flying saucers, let's assume it would be the first solar system planet to be explored from the Earth. As the spaceship neared Mars, it could be turned to circle the planet in an orbit, just like our planned Earth satellite vehicle. Once in this orbit, it could circle indefinitely without using fuel except to correct its course. From this space base, unmanned remote control, observer, units with television, eyes, or other transmitters would be sent down to survey the planet at close range. If it then seemed fairly safe, a manned unit could be released to make a more thorough checkup. Such preliminary caution would be imperative. Our explorers would have no idea of what awaited them. The planet might be uninhabited. It might be peopled by a fiercely barbarous race unaware of civilization as we know it. Or it might have a civilization far in advance of ours. The explorers would first try to get a general idea of the whole planet. Then they would attempt to examine the most densely populated areas, types of armature, any aircraft likely to attack them. Combing the radio spectrum, they would pick up and record sounds and signals in order to decipher the language. As on Earth, they might hear a hodgepodge of tongues. The next step would be to select the most technically advanced nation, listen in, and try to learn its language, or record it for deciphering afterward on Earth. Our astronomers already have analyzed Mars's atmosphere, but the explorers would have to confirm their reports, to find out whether the atmosphere at the surface would support their lungs if they landed. The easiest way would be to send down manned or unmanned units with special apparatus to scoop in atmosphere samples. Later analysis would tell whether Earthlings would need oxygen helmet suits such as we plan to use on the Moon. But before risking flight at such low altitudes, the explorers would first learn everything possible about the planet's aircraft, if any. They would try to determine their top ceiling, maximum speed, maneuverability, and if possible their weapons. Much of this could be done by sending down remote control, observer, discs, or whatever type we decide to use. A manned unit might make a survey at night, or in daytime with clouds nearby to shield it. By hovering over the planet's aircraft bases, the explorers could get most of the picture, and also decide whether the bases were suitable for their own use later. It might even be necessary to lure some Martian aircraft into pursuit of our units, to find out their performance. But our explorers would above all avoid any sign of hostility. They would hastily withdraw to show they had no warlike intentions. If the appearance of our observer units and manned craft caused too violent reactions on the planet, the explorers would withdraw to their orbiting space vehicle and either wait for a lull or else start the long trip back home. Another interplanetary craft from the Earth might take its place later to resume periodic surveys. In this way, a vast amount of information could be collected without once making contact with the strange race. If they seemed belligerent or uncivilized, we would probably end our survey and check on the next possibly inhabited planet. If we found they were highly civilized, we would undoubtedly attempt later contact. But it might take a long time, decades of observation and analysis, before we were ready for that final step. We might find a civilization not quite so advanced as ours. It might not yet have developed radio and television. We would then have no way of getting a detailed picture, learning the languages, or communicating with the Martians. Analysis of their atmosphere might show a great hazard to Earthlings, one making it impossible to land or requiring years of research to overcome. There might be other obstacles beyond our present understanding. This same procedure would apply to the rest of the solar system planets, and to more distant systems. Since Wolf 359 is the nearest star outside our system that is likely to have inhabited planets, one of these planets would probably be listed as the first to explore in far distant space. It would be a tremendous undertaking, unless the speed of light can be exceeded in space. Since Wolf 359 is 8 light-years from the Earth, even if a spaceship traveled at the theoretical maximum, just under 186,000 miles a second, it would take over 16 years for the round trip. Detailed observation of the planet would add to this period. If we assume half that speed, which would still be an incredible attainment with our present knowledge, our space explorers would have to dedicate at least 32 years to the hazardous, lonely round trip. However, there has never been a lack of volunteers for grand undertakings in the history of man. It is quite possible that in our survey of the solar system planets we would find some inhabited, but not advanced enough to be of interest to us. Periodically, we might make return visits to note their progress. Meantime, our astronomers would watch these planets, probably developing new, higher-powered telescopes for the purpose, to detect any signs of unusual activity. Any tremendous explosion on a planet would immediately concern us. Such an explosion, on Mars, was reported by astronomers on January 16, 1950. The cause and general effects are still being debated. Sadao Seki, the Japanese astronomer who first reported it at Osaka, believes it was of volcanic nature. The explosion created a cloud over an area about 700 miles in diameter and 40 miles high. It was dull gray with a yellowish tinge and a different color from the atmospheric phenomena customarily seen near Mars. Seki believes the blast might have destroyed any form of life existing on the planet, but even though the telescopic camera recorded a violent explosion, Other authorities do not believe the planet was wrecked. The canals first discovered on Mars by Giovanni Schiaparelli, about 1877, are still apparent on photographs. Mars is now being carefully watched by astronomers. If there are more of the strange explosions, the planet will be scanned constantly for some clue to their nature. If a mysterious explosion on Mars, or any other planet, were found of atomic origin, it would cause serious concern on Earth. Suppose for a moment that it happened many years from now, when we will have succeeded in space explorations. At this time, let us assume our explorers have found that Mars is experimenting with high-altitude rockets. Some of them have been seen, rising at tremendous speed, in the upper atmosphere of Mars. Then comes this violent explosion. A scientific analysis of the cloud by astrophysicists here on Earth proves it was of atomic origin. The first reaction would undoubtedly be an immediate resurvey of Mars. As quickly as possible, we would establish an orbiting space base, out of range of Martian rockets, and try to find how far they had advanced with atomic bombs. Samples of the Martian atmosphere would be collected and analyzed for telltale radiation. Observer units would be flown over the planet, with instruments to locate atom bomb plants and possibly uranium deposits. The
rocket launching bases would also come under close observation. We would try to learn how close the scientists were to escaping the pull of gravity. Since Mars's gravity is much less than the Earth's, the Martians would not have so far to progress before succeeding in space travel. The detailed survey by our space base observers would probably show that there was no immediate danger to the Earth. It might take 100 years, perhaps 500, before the Martians could be a problem. Eventually, the time would come when Mars would send out spaceship explorers. They would undoubtedly discover that the Earth was populated with a technically advanced civilization. Any warlike ideas they had in mind could be quickly ended by a show of our superior spacecraft and our own atomic weapons, probably far superior to any on Mars. It might even be possible that by then we would have finally outlawed war. If so, a promise to share the peaceful benefits of our technical knowledge might be enough to bring Martian leaders into line. Regardless of our final decision, we would certainly keep a loose watch on Mars or any other planet that seemed a possible threat. Now, if our space exploration program is just reversed, it will give a reasonable picture of how visitors from space might go about investigating the Earth. Such an investigation would tie in with the general pattern of authentic flying saucer reports. 1. Worldwide sightings at long intervals up to the middle of the 19th century. 2. Concentration on Europe as the most advanced section of the globe until late in the 19th century. 3. Frequent surveys of America in the latter part of the 19th century, as we began to develop industrially, with cities springing up across the land. 4. periodic surveys of both America and Europe during the gradual development of aircraft from the early 1900s up to World War II. 5. An increase of observation during World War II, after German V-2s were launched up into the stratosphere. 6. A steadily increasing survey after our atomic bomb explosions in New Mexico, Japan, Bikini, and Eniwetok. 7. A second spurt of observations following atom bomb explosions in Soviet Russia. 8. Continuing observations of the Earth at regular intervals, with most attention concentrated on the United States, the present leader in atomic weapons. Sources have been reported seen over the Soviet Union, but the number is unknown. There is some evidence that Russia has an investigative unit similar to Project Saucer. There are other points of similarity to the program of American space exploration that I have outlined. Most of the extremely large sources have been at high altitudes, some of them many miles above the Earth. At that height, a spaceship would be in no danger from our planes and anti-aircraft guns and rockets. The smaller disks and the mystery lights have been seen at low altitudes. Occasionally a larger saucer has been seen to approach the Earth briefly, as at Lockbourne Air Force Base, at Bethel, Alabama, at Macon and Montgomery, and other places. It has been suggested that this was for the purpose of securing atmospheric samples. It could also be to afford personal observation by the crews. The numerous small disks seen in the first part of the scare, in 1947, fit the pattern for preliminary and close observation by remote-controlled observer units. As the scare increased, the daytime sightings decreased for a while, and mystery lights began to be seen more often. This apparent desire to avoid unfavorable attention could have been caused by our pilots' repeated attempts to chase the strange flying objects. Authentic reports have described sightings over the following Air Force bases: Chanute, Newark, Andrews, Hickam, Robbins, Godman, Clark, Fairfield Swaysan, Davis-Monthan, Harmon, Wright-Patterson, Holloman, Clinton County Air Force Base, and air bases in Alaska, Germany, and the Azores. Sources have also been sighted over naval air stations at Dallas, Alameda, and Key West, and from the station at Seattle. They have been reported maneuvering over the White Sands Proving Ground, over areas containing atomic developments, above the Muroc Air Base testing area, and over the super-secret research base near Albuquerque. Several times sources have paced both military and civil aircraft. Their actions strongly indicate deliberate encounters to learn our plane's speed and performance. It seems obvious that both the planes and the bases were being observed, and in some cases photographed by remote control units or manned spaceships. Although I thought it improbable that the location of our uranium deposits would be of interest to spacemen, a Washington official told me it would be relatively simple to detect the ore areas with airborne instruments. The Geological Survey has already developed special Geiger counters for planes, he told me. They had a little trouble from cosmic ray noise. They finally had to cover the Geigers with lead shields. Whenever an important amount of radiation is present in the ground, the plane crew gets a signal, and they spot the place on their map. It's a quick way of locating valuable deposits. When I told him what I had in mind, he suggested an angle I had not considered. Mind you, he said, I'm not completely sold on the interplanetary answer. But assuming it's correct that we are being observed, I can think of a stronger reason than fear of some distant attack. Some atomic scientists say that a superatomic bomb, or several set off at once, could knock the Earth out of its orbit. It sounds fantastic, but so is the A-bomb. It's just possible that some solar planet race discovered the dangers long ago. They would have good reason to worry if they found we were on that same track. There may be some other atomic weapon we don't suspect, even worse than the A-bomb, one that could destroy the Earth and seriously affect other planets. At the time, I thought this was just idle speculation. But since then, several atomic scientists have confirmed this official suggestion. One of these was Dr. Paul Elliott, a nuclear physicist who worked on the A-bomb during the war. According to Dr. Elliott, if several hydrogen bombs were exploded simultaneously at a high altitude, it could speed up the Earth's rotation or change its orbit. He based his statement on the rate of energy the Earth receives from the Sun, a rate equal to some 4 pounds of hydrogen exploded every second. Still, other atomic scientists have said that H-bomb explosions might even knock a large chunk out of the Earth, with unpredictable results. A dramatic picture of what might happen if the Earth were forced far out of its orbit is indicated in the much-discussed book Worlds in Collision by Dr. Immanuel Velikovsky, recently published by Macmillan. After many years of research, Dr. Velikovsky presents strong evidence that the planet Venus, when still a comet resulting from eruption from a larger planet, moved erratically about the sky and violently disturbed both the Earth and Mars. When the comet approached the Earth, our planet was forced out of its orbit, according to Worlds in Collision. For a time, the world was on the brink of destruction. Quoting many authentic ancient records, including the Keyhoe manuscript of the Mayas, the Ipuwer papyrus of the Egyptians, and the Visiddhimagga of the Buddhists, Dr. Velikovsky describes the cataclysm that took place. The face of the earth changed, he writes in his book. The details, reinforced by the Zendavesta of the Persians, tell of tremendous hurricanes, of a major upheaval in the Earth's surface, of oceans rushing over many parts of the land, while rivers were driven from their beds. Some of the events in this period are mentioned in the Bible. Professor Horace M. Corlin, former dean of the New School of Social Research, strongly endorses Dr. Velikovsky's statements. It is my belief that Velikovsky has supported his theses with substantial evidence, and made an effective and persuasive argument. Many other authorities endorse this work, which is documented with impressive references. But even if this particular account is not accepted, all astronomers agree that the effect of a comet passing near the Earth would be appalling. Worlds in Collision states that Mars, like the Earth, was pulled out of its orbit by the comet's erratic passage. It may be that this near disaster to the Earth and Mars is known on other solar planets, or remembered on Mars itself, if the planet is inhabited. The possibility of superbomb explosions on the Earth understandably disturb any dwellers on other solar system planets. This may be what was back of the Project Saucer's statement on the probable motives of any visitors from space. I mentioned this Air Force statement in an earlier chapter, but it may be of interest to repeat it at this time. The comment appeared in a confidential analysis of intelligence reports in the formerly secret Project Saucer document, Report on Unidentified Aerial and Celestial Objects. It reads as follows. Such a civilization might observe that on Earth we now have atomic bombs and are fast developing rockets. In view of the past history of mankind, they should be alarmed. We should therefore expect at this time above all to behold such visitations. Since the acts of mankind most easily observed from a distance are A-bomb explosions, we should expect some relation to obtain between the time of the A-bomb explosions, the time at which the space ships are seen, and the time required for such ships to arrive from and return to home base. Chapter 15. It was early in October 1949 when I finished the reversal of our space exploration plans. I spent the next 2 days running down a sighting report from a town in Pennsylvania. Like 3 or 4 other tips that had seemed important at first, it turned out to be a dud. When I got back home, I found Ken Purdy had been trying to reach me. I phoned him at True, and he asked me to fly up to New York the next day. I've just heard there's another magazine working on the Saucer story, he told me. Who is it? I said. I don't know yet. It may be just a rumor, but we can't take a chance. We've got to get this in the January book. That night I gathered up all the material. It looked hopeless to condense it into one article, and I knew that Purdy had even more investigators' reports waiting for me in New York. Flying up the next morning, I suddenly thought of a talk I'd had with an air transport official. It was in Washington. I had just told him about the investigation. If they are spacemen, he said, they'd probably have a hard time figuring out this country by listening to our broadcasts. Imagine tuning in soap operas, The Lone Ranger, and a couple of crime yarns, along with newscasts about strikes and murders and the Cold War. They might pick up some of those kid programs about rocket ships. A few days of listening to that stuff, well, it would give them one hell of a picture. Except for some hoax reports, this was the first funny suggestion I'd had about the spacemen. But now, thinking seriously about it, I realized he had an important point. It was possible that men from another planet might have to reorient even their way of thinking to understand the Earth's ways. It would not be automatic, despite their superior technical progress. Evolution might have produced basic differences in their understanding of life. Humor, for instance, might be totally lacking in their makeup. What would they be like? I tried to imagine how they might look without getting anywhere. Dr. H. Spencer Jones hadn't helped much with his life on other worlds. I couldn't begin to visualize beings with totally different cells, perhaps able to take terrific heat or bitter cold as merely normal weather. There were all kinds of possibilities. If they lived on Mars, for instance, perhaps they couldn't take the heavier gravity of the Earth. They might be easily subject to our diseases, especially if they had destroyed disease germs on their planet, a natural step for an advanced race. It was possible, I knew, that the spacemen might look grotesque to us. But I clung to a stubborn feeling that they would resemble man. That came, of course, from an inborn feeling of man's superiority over all living things. It carried over into a feeling that any thinking, intelligent being, whether on Mars or Wolf 359's planets, should have evolved in the same form. I gave up trying to imagine how the spacemen might look. There was simply nothing to go on. But there were strong indications of how they thought and reacted. Certain qualities were plainly evident. Intelligence. No one could dispute that. It took a high order of mentality to construct and operate a spaceship. Courage. It would take brave men to face the hazards of space. Curiosity. Without this quality, they would never have thought to explore far-distant planets. There were other qualities that seemed almost equally certain. These spacemen apparently lacked belligerence. There had been no sign of hostility through all the years. They were seemingly painstaking and extremely methodical. It was still not much of a picture. But somehow, it was encouraging. Glancing down from the plane's window, I thought, how does this look to them? Our farms, our cities, the railroads there below, the highways, with the speeding cars and trucks, the winding river, and far off to the right, the broad stretch of the Atlantic. What would they think of America? Manhattan came into sight as the pilot let down for the landing. An odd thought popped into my mind. How would a spaceman react if he saw a Broadway show? Not long before, I had seen South Pacific. I could still hear Ezio Pinza's magnificent voice as he sang Some Enchanted Evening. Was music a part of spacemen's lives, or would it be something new and strange, perhaps completely distasteful? They might live and think on a coldly intelligent level, without a touch of what we know as emotion. To them, our lives might seem meaningless and dull. We ourselves might appear grotesque in form. But in their progress, there must have been struggle, trial and error, some feeling of triumph at success. Surely these would be emotional forces, bound to reflect in the planet races. Perhaps, in spite of some differences, we would find a common bond, the bond of thinking, intelligent creatures trying to better themselves. The airliner landed and taxied in to unload. As I went down the gangway, I suddenly realized something. My last vague fear was gone. It had not been a personal fear of the visitors from space. It had been a selfish fear of the impact on my life. I realized that now. It might be a long time before they would try to make contact. But I had a conviction that when it came, it would be a peaceful mission, not an ultimatum. It could even be the means of ending wars on Earth. But I had been conditioned to this thing. I had had 6 months of preparation, 6 months to go from complete skepticism to slow, final acceptance. What if it had been thrown at me in black headlines? Even a peaceful contact by beings from another planet would profoundly affect the world. The story in True might play an important part in that final effect. Carefully done, it could help prepare Americans for the official disclosure. But if it weren't done right, we might be opening a Pandora's box. Chapter 16. That morning, at True, we made the final decisions on how to handle the story. Using the evidence of the Mantell case, the Chillis-Whitted report, Gorman's Mystery Light encounter, and other authentic cases, along with the records of early sightings, we would state our main conclusion, that the flying saucers were interplanetary. In going over the mass of reports, Purdy and I both realized that a few sightings did not fit the space observer pattern. Most of these reports came from the Southwest states, where guided missile experiments were going on. Purdy agreed with Paul Reddell that any long-range tests would be made over the sea or unpopulated areas, with every attempt at secrecy. They might make short-range tests down there in New Mexico, and Arizona maybe over Texas, he said. But they'd never risk killing people by shooting the things all over the country. They've already set up a 3,000-mile range for the longer runs, I added. It runs from Florida into the South Atlantic. And the Navy missiles at Point Mugu are launched out over the Pacific. Any guided missiles coming down over settled areas would certainly be an accident. Besides all that, no missile on Earth can explain these major cases. Purdy was emphatic about speculating on our guided missile research. Suppose you analyzed these minor cases that look like missile tests. You might accidentally give away something important, like their range and speeds. Look what the Russians did with the A-bomb hints Washington let out. It was finally decided that we would briefly mention the guided missiles, along with the fact that the armed services had flatly denied any link with the sources. After all, interplanetary travel is the main story, said Purdy. And the Mantell case alone proves we've been observed from spaceships, even without the old records. The question of the story's impact worried both of us. Public acceptance of intelligent life on other planets would affect almost every phase of our existence: business, defense planning, philosophy, even religion. Of course, the immediate effect was more important. Personally, I thought that most Americans could take even an official announcement without too much trouble. But I could be wrong. The only yardstick, and that's not much good, is that little men story, said Purdy. A lot of people have got excited about it, but they seem more interested than scared. The story of the little men from Venus had been circulating for some time. In the usual version, 2 flying saucers had come down near our southwest border. In the spacecraft were several oddly dressed men, 3 feet high. All of them were dead. The cause was usually given as inability to stand our atmosphere. The Air Force was said to have hushed up the story so that the public could be educated gradually to the truth. Though it had all the earmarks of a well-thought-out hoax, many newspapers had repeated the story. It had even been broadcast as fact on several radio newscasts. But there had been no signs of public alarm. It looks as if people have come a long way since that Orson Welles scare, I said to Purdy. But there isn't any menace in this story, he objected. The crews were reported dead, so everybody got the idea that spacemen couldn't live if they landed. What if a spaceship should suddenly come down over a big city, say New York, low enough for millions of people to see it? It might cause a stampede, I said. Purdy snorted. It would be a miracle if it didn't, unless people had been fully prepared. If we do a straight fact piece, just giving the evidence, it will start the ball rolling. People at least will be thinking about it. Before I left for Washington, I told Purdy of my last visit to the Pentagon. I had informed Air Force press relations officials of True's intention to publish the space travel answer. There had been no attempt to dissuade me. And I had been told once again that there was no security involved, that Project Saucer had found nothing threatening the safety of America. At this time, I had also asked if Project Saucer files were now available. The Wright Field Unit, I was told, still was a classified project, both its files and its photographs secret. This had been the first week in October. When I asked if there was any other information on published cases, the answer again was negative. The April 27th report, according to press branch officials, was still an accurate statement of Air Force opinions and policies. So far as they knew, No other explanations had been found for the unidentified sources. I am absolutely convinced now, I told Purdy, that he is an official policy to let the thing leak out. It explains why Forrestal announced our Earth satellite vehicle program years before we could even start to build it. It also would explain those Project Saucer hints in the April report. I think we are being used as a trial balloon, Purdy said thoughtfully. We've let them know what we are doing. If they'd wanted to stop us, the Air Force could easily have done it. All they'd have to do would be call us in, give us the dope off the record, and tell us it was a patriotic duty to keep still. Just the way they did about uranium and atomic experiments during the war. He still did not have the name of the other magazine supposed to be working on the sources. But it seemed a reliable tip. It later proved to be true, and from then on we worked under high pressure. In writing the article, I used only the most authentic recent sightings. All of the cases were in the Air Force reports. When it came to the Mantell case, I stuck to published estimates of the strange object's size. A mysterious ship 250 to 300 feet in diameter was startling enough. At first, I chose Mars to illustrate our space explorations. But Mars had been associated with the Orson Welles stampede. Most discussions of the planet had a menacing note, perhaps because of its warlike name. In the end, I switched to a planet of Wolf 359. The thought of those 8 light years would have a comforting effect on any nervous readers. The chance of any mass visitation would seem remote, if not impossible. But it would still put across the space travel story. As finally revised, the article, written under my byline, stated the following points as the conclusions reached by True. 1. For the past 175 years, the Earth has been under systematic close-range examination by living, intelligent observers from another planet. 2. The intensity of this observation and the frequency of the visits to the Earth's atmosphere have increased markedly during the past 2 years. 3. The vehicles used for this observation and for interplanetary transport by the explorers have been classed as follows. Type 1, a small, non-pilot carrying disc-shaped craft equipped with some form of television or impulse transmitter. Type 2, a very large, metallic, disc-shaped aircraft operating on the helicopter principle. Type 3, a dirigible-shaped, wingless aircraft that, in the Earth's atmosphere, operates in conformance with the Prandtl theory of lift. 4. The discernible patterns of observation and exploration shown by the so-called flying discs varies in no important particular from well-developed American plans for the exploration of space, expected to come to fruition within the next 50 years. There is reason to believe, however, that some other race of thinking beings is a matter of 2.25 centuries ahead of us.